Hello and welcome to this week's Why We Eat What We Eat module in the psychology of eating. So there are many reasons why we eat what we eat. Maybe cultural reasons, maybe cost, it may be religious reasons, it may be just what we grew up with, things that we've encountered on travels. There's so many different reasons that fuel our food choices, and some of them have nothing to do with hunger. More on that one to come. But in today's lecture, I want to talk about how we got to be at our adult stage making the kinds of food choices that we got to make based on the research. So let's get started. So why do people choose the foods that they choose? So eating is an intentional act. We need it to survive. As we talked about last week, food is fuel, calories are energy. And so we can be very intentional and make choices about what we want to eat. Again, fueled by a variety of different reasons. So people choose what to eat, where to eat, who to eat with, how to prepare it, and so many other different things. So foodways are the sum of our culture's habits, customs, beliefs, and preferences concerning food. And again, this may be completely based on your culture. Culture is very broadly termed here. It could be based on gender roles in your household. It could be based on religious preferences. It could be based on moral preferences, things of growing up. Maybe you don't want to eat meat. There are a variety of things that fall into foodways. So foodways are just the different beliefs we have, preferences, customs, etc. Just so we have some common terminology moving forward. So where do the foodways come from? Let's take it back to when you were born. So how do we learn these foodways? So when children are first born, there are a number of things that we note. So for the first couple of years of life, if left to their own devices, children will tend to gravitate toward foods that they enjoy for whatever reason. Could be taste preferences, could be exposure to flavors that mom ate while they were in utero. So children tend to like things that mom ate when she was pregnant. But often there's some neophobia concerning food. If mom did not eat that particular food when pregnant, the child is kind of wired to be a little bit fearful of whatever food substance is being introduced. And so if you've had young children at home or been around young children, you know that sometimes this can result in some food wars in your household in terms of what your child will and won't eat. Perfectly normal. This is perfectly natural. A lot of times I get parents of toddlers who just want their kids to eat Brussels sprouts. And I'm like, yeah, it'll come or it won't. Yes, expose your children to all different kinds of new foods that you might be eating, but trying to force them to eat it may not be a great idea because you're fighting that innate fear of trying new things that is really there for protective reasons, right? As infants, we should fear the new because we don't know if it's safe for us or not, and that includes food. So as we grow up, we tend to outgrow that. So again, first couple of years of life, for some kids, neophobia lasts to even age 5, but typically within the first couple of years of life, new parents will notice that their children are tolerating more foods, they're more willing to try new foods, they're kind of gotten over that fear of things that are new. So parental attitudes and modeling obviously impact children's food choice, so what that child is exposed to at home, in daycare, in early childhood education is going to influence their taste preferences and their eating habits. Now, going back to the parenting question, because I know I have some parents in here, I had an argument with a student one year who really, really wanted her 2-year-old to eat Brussels sprouts. And she's like, well, if I just bribe her, won't she eat them? And I said, perhaps, but. So the associative learning theory does suggest that, yes, you can get your child to eat new things by rewarding them with something that they like. However, when the reward is also a food item. So in this case, this particular student was trying to bribe her daughter to eat Brussels sprouts by rewarding her with chocolate. That just actually ties those two foods together. And so then the child will not eat Brussels sprouts without the chocolate because you've just paired them together. So if you've had a learning class, you're very familiar with this idea. You're just pairing two substances together, they get connected in our mind, and then it becomes hard to disentangle them. If you want your child to try new foods, absolutely put them on the plate, but don't try to force it, and please don't bribe them because that will tend to backfire. So after we get through that early childhood experience, through toddlerhood, our food ways come from beliefs that are passed down to us. It could be food rules, it could be a lot of dieting in our household, restrictive eating that we've gotten from mom or dad or big sister or big brother, or we've seen at school. So we get more say in what we eat often, but we're also learning very rapidly about what foods are labeled good and what foods are labeled bad in our culture. And so if you grew up in a household where there were foods that you were allowed to eat and foods that you weren't allowed to eat, obviously that is going to inform your food choices moving forward. Children will often just eat what their parents put in front of them, but as they get into their teenage years, they may start to rebel and want to try the things that mom or dad forbid them to eat. So I had a student once whose parents, her mom was a dietitian and her dad was a triathlete. And so they ate very healthy foods, but they also had a lot of food restrictions in their household. She was never allowed to eat candy or anything sweet. She wasn't allowed to eat gluten or dairy, not because of food allergies, but just because of her parents' food preferences. And so she said when she got to high school, and then especially when she got to college, she went a little crazy because suddenly mom and dad weren't there to monitor her food intake anymore. So she just started eating all the stuff that they never allowed her to eat. So we look to others to inform our eating decisions. And as we grow up, our peers often become more influential than our caregivers. But yes, we have the neophobia. Yes, we have rules and regulations and restrictions that we learn as we get older, but we still can't completely discount biology. So last week we talked some about the digestive hormones involved in eating process of kind of walking you through being hungry to being full and what happens with our digestive hormones. The other things that we need to consider are that the sight of food can induce hunger and salivation in participants who aren't even hungry. So I often have students talk about, walked by the bakery and I had just eaten lunch, but I went in anyway because suddenly I was just hungry and I was salivating and craving a donut or whatever. There's some fascinating studies done out of Food Lab at Cornell that have found that studies in the movie theater back before COVID, when we went to movie theaters, they were doing what's called the stale popcorn study. And they would make popcorn and then leave it for 4 days. It was just nasty. And they would get participants coming in to watch movies at the movie theater, and they would look at participants who hadn't eaten lunch or dinner versus those who had, and they gave them this free stale popcorn, didn't tell them it was stale, free popcorn, and would measure how much they eat. And they actually found that there wasn't much difference between the people who had just eaten and those who were hungry. They all liked the stale popcorn. So the sight of food can induce hunger and salivation, even if we're full, right? So that's a biological mechanism that we can't just turn off. Again, a tendency to favor certain foods might be based on those early survival mechanisms. That neophobia is very much based on this idea that if I don't know if I should eat it, I'm going to avoid it. But if mom ate something while she was pregnant with us, then we feel like it's safe because we've already had exposure to it. Again, that is completely physiological. We do outgrow that neophobia, but it's there for a reason. We also know that food, as we just talked about, can be considered a reward. And so if you've bribed your kids with chocolate, or your parents bribed you to eat certain foods with dessert, then that exposure to food increases your dopamine in your brain, which is the reward system. And so we can end up associating food with reward. And again, regardless if we're hungry or not, if we go by a chocolate shop and chocolate is our reward, we're going to be hungry for chocolate and start craving it. So how do we put all of this together? So the food choice process model is kind of the gold standard these days for measuring all of the different factors that influence what we eat. And so you'll notice that at the very top of the inverted pyramid, we have kind of all of our life course events and experiences. So this can be all the things that we learned while we were growing up, what our family ate, when we ate, like the timing of food. If your family always ate at 5, that just may be what you were used to until you got older. Context in terms of we eat turkey at Thanksgiving, we eat ham at Christmas, right? So there's a lot of different sociocultural rules that we learn about food. And then as we get older and we have a little bit more control, we have our own personal preferences. Some of those, again, may be genetic. Things like cilantro tend to be heavily genetic in terms of taste preferences. You either love it or you think it's disgusting. There's really no in between. There are a number of foods that are like that. Tolerance for hot foods, spicy foods is the same. It seems to be very much genetic. Also could just be your personal preferences of things that you've learned as you've grown up. Your resources, how much money do you have? How much time do you have to prepare meals? Where are you eating? Who are you eating with? And what are they eating? So all of these influences that go into your food choices. And this was kind of what you've developed over time. Your own system of food rules or food ways that you've learned from a variety of different sources are then going to predict what you actually eat, in terms of what you buy, how you prepare it, how you serve it, where you shop, whether you leave dishes in the sink until the sink is full or whether you clean up after yourself immediately. All of those things go into our food ways and the way that we decide what we're going to eat. Last but not least, I want to touch on where you eat, because there's some fascinating research that's been done on location. So you may have heard of the term mindful eating, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next lecture. The idea behind mindful eating is that, remember last week we talked about it takes about 20 minutes between when you actually get full for your brain to signal it's full, because of all of the things that have to happen in your body in terms of a specific trajectory of hormone release for that signal to get released to your brain. So if you're mindfully eating, that tends to happen on track because you kind of naturally stop when you get full because you're paying attention to what you're eating and your body's signals. However, in today's busy society, a lot of us multitask while we're eating. And that may be eating in social settings with friends, we're out at restaurants, we're in a bar. We tend to eat less nutritiously because A, we're not paying attention, B, we have that peer influence. C, it also kind of depends on who we are with. So are we with family? Are we with friends? Are we on a date? So research, funny story, research actually backs the notion that when people are on a date, for the first date, they are a lot more cautious about what they eat, especially women. And again, these tend to be sociocultural rules. Not all women are, but some women were socialized to not eat in a way that's not healthy in front of men that they don't know very well. So kind of the first date salad phenomenon, right? So you may be familiar with this idea, actually backed by the research. We also, in social settings, when we're talking about who we're eating with, were we teased by those individuals? So if you were teased as a child or an adolescent about your weight or about your food, even as an adult, 30, 40 years later, you still may be very careful about what you eat around the people who teased you. When we're eating with our family, we just tend to eat more nutritiously. Again, not all the time, but research tends to suggest, especially if we're sitting at the table. So not if we're in the car on the way to soccer practice or we're eating in front of the TV, more on that next. But when we're eating with family sitting at a table, we tend to eat more nutritiously, especially if we've all been involved in that food preparation, we cooked together, we sit down together, we eat together, we talk while we're eating about our day or whatever. So we tend to eat a little bit more nutritiously than when we're when we are with our friends or on our own. Now, back to the mindful eating. We tend to not eat very well when we're in front of the TV, when we're driving, or just in a car in general. We tend to eat less nutritiously. I think part of this is just a practical reason. We want to eat foods that aren't as messy. We want to eat foods that probably don't take a lot of preparation. Maybe we just went through the drive-through because we're rushing from soccer practice to class or work or wherever we're going. We just tend to eat next nutritiously. And the Jamie Oliver video last week actually talked about handheld foods. They create less of a mess, and so they're a lot more convenient, and we tend to eat them, especially when we are in a rush. All right. So next up, we will talk about reasons we eat when we're not hungry. More to come.